So I just want to talk a little bit about technique and the use of technique in my restaurant and through my career as a chef. And I've been basically based in French cuisine my entire career, and how I use old techniques and modern techniques, and which is superior, old French techniques or modern techniques. And I'll just give you a bit of history about me and the way I came to be where I am right now. But I started my career at Waterside Inn, which is a 3 Michelin star under Alan Roux, and I was there for a short period of time, about 7 months, about 17, 18 years old. And at that point, I just didn't have the technique, I didn't have the skill to work at that level. Alan Roux sat me down and basically explained that, you know, if you want to really cook French food, if you want to do this type of cuisine, then you need to work in France. You need to go and study in France, even better. So I made the decision to move to Paris and go and study at Le Cordon Bleu there, and I didn't speak a word of French at the time, and did the lessons and trained myself up. But, you know, what it gave me at that point was an outlook of French cuisine, which, as a young man in my early 20s, I didn't appreciate that much. A lot of cream, a lot of butter. And I looked at it as it being old-fashioned, as it being uncool, essentially, and I never really took much notice of it. And at the time in Paris, what we called as the gastronomie movement was taking off, where a lot of high-profile chefs were taking over little tiny bistros and cooking Michelin-starred food in these tiny spaces. And I got hugely influenced by it. I really, really wanted to do it, and that's what I always saw myself doing in the future. But looking at it now, I look back at it and I sort of ignored all that classical French training, all the roux and the bechamels and the hollandaise sauces, all things I looked at as old-fashioned. So on my return to England, I worked at a lot of modern cooking places, a lot of molecular gastronomy places using new techniques, a lot of chemicals. And whilst working there, I discovered that that's not cooking, in my opinion. I wanted to actually cook things over flame and touch and feel. I actually wanted to make bread from scratch. I wanted to make butter from scratch. And I realized that whilst my time in France at the time might have not been that influential at the time, I started then to travel back and have a look what actually these gastronomy restaurants were doing. And actually what they were doing were cooking French food in a sort of modern fashion. But they weren't ignoring the classics, they were embracing them. They were still doing dishes like hare à la royale, but just serving it in a more lighter way. They were still, you know, cooking some asparagus, but serving with sauce grebeche, but just making it a bit more lighter. And it fascinated me, this. I looked at it and went, oh, you know, I looked at it completely the wrong way, and all my time in Paris I felt maybe had been wasted. So I started to research old books, and you have a vast amount of information in old gastronomy books, vast amounts. You can pick up a really modern cookbook right now, and it has all the different sous vide techniques in the world, and you can look at a very old cookbook and you go, well, how did they reduce the same techniques as essentially what is, I think, cheating in some ways? So when I came to eventually open Le Cochon Aveugle, once again I came under fault of being a young man and looking at what was trendy rather than delicious when we very first opened. And, you know, the sous vide machines came out, and I'm not against using modern techniques. In certain techniques they are very good, but I wanted to do something different, and French food in this country became quite unpopular, it became unfashionable, it wasn't looked upon in the same way. A new wave of Scandinavian food and modern Spanish food started to take over the scene of the dining, especially in London. And after 2 years of being heavily influenced by those techniques, I looked at it and was like, well, I'm just the same as everybody else right now. I'm not doing anything differently. So then the old cookbooks came back out, and I started to look through and what could if I looked backwards, could I move forwards? And it was a big, massive turning point of my food and the way I looked at how I cook, and starting to look at the history, the real history of food. And maybe if I apply these old cooking techniques, maybe I can get a flavour out of food that nobody else produces right now in the country. So I'll just throw out a few examples of like really the big turning points are. So I saw a lot of, game, for instance. Not a lot of people started to cook game anymore, big flavours of game, and that, became unpopular. But I thought, you know what, I'm just going to make people eat it. So at my restaurant, there's a set menu. It's a blind menu, so you would walk in tomorrow, and there's no menu, and I give you whatever I decide to cook that day. So to put hare on the menu as the main course, hare à la royale, was a huge risk, essentially, because it is a strong flavour. But I really wanted to do it because I believed in the classical cooking techniques of it. I believed what it stood for. So basically, you bone out a whole hare, stuff it with duck's liver and a farce, roll it up, cook it in a stock, and then with the blood of the hare, you make a thickened sauce and cover it. It's like a big sheen over it. And then we serve it to the guests with a few fruits. And it had a 50-50 response. But it set me apart from what most other people were doing. Nobody else in York was serving that dish at the time, and I don't suppose you would find it in game season this year coming up. And it set me apart. So then I read into, right, well, we've done a classical dish. How about we then look at actual really old-fashioned techniques of cooking? And I looked at old-fashioned equipment. So originally, I was talking to Francis earlier about it, I wanted what's called a duck press, where essentially you cook a duck, take the breasts and legs off, and then you crush the bones in front of all your guests, and out comes the juice, and you make the sauce in front of your diners. And I thought, oh, this would be wonderful. But unfortunately, they cost about £3,000, and I didn't want to take that out of my pocket. So then I was on a trip in the Savoie region of France, skiing, and I went to a restaurant which they were using what's called a flambeau à lard, or a flamadou, which is called in Scandinavian. And essentially it's a long iron pipe with an iron funnel with a hole in the bottom of it. And I was fascinated, and they put it in the flame so it went glowing red hot. And I was fascinated by that. I'd never seen it before in my life. So I asked the chef about it, and he showed me what it was. And you essentially get the iron red hot, and then you put cold lard in the funnel, and it's so hot that it ignites, and then a lard flame goes down and cooks whatever you choose to cook, whether it would be a steak or it would be oysters. And I decided to get one made for myself at the restaurant. And the point is right there, I looked back in history and used this old-fashioned technique, and it was delicious. We cook oysters with lamb fat over it. And I'm producing a dish that nobody else, to my knowledge, in the UK is producing right now, and it's delicious. And that wasn't me using any new techniques. I was just looking at the history of what happened in France before the use of pots and pans. How did they sear steaks? How did they sear a chicken? And then we found a dish, and that's how real modern cooking in my restaurant is done. And so then just my biggest point, and just before I go, was the use of sous vide. And it is, if none of you know what a sous vide is, essentially it's putting a piece of protein or a vegetable in a vacuum-sealed bag and cooking it at a certain temperature to get consistent results. Now, it has different views from different chefs. Some are very against it, some are very for it. People like me use it for specific types of cuts of meat if I think they need a longer period of cooking time. But I found myself reliant on it in a way, and I found my chefs becoming lazy, and they weren't really learning how to cook, and I wanted to steer them away from this technique. So I really enjoy French guinea fowl. We have a supplier of getting French guinea fowl over. I really like its fatty qualities. And I read in a technique of cooking the whole bird in a pig's bladder. And so essentially you get the bird, put it in the pig's bladder, put some truffles, some mushroom stock, some chicken stock, and a little bit of its livers in there. Tie it round twice, and then you put it in a pan of simmering stock, and it sort of inflates like a massive balloon, and then you take it to your guests and cut it open. And once again, it was a really good point of looking back in history of how something is done rather than looking forward, because the result was far superior than the actual sous videing of the chicken, which I was doing before. And right there, I always needed to remember my few years of cooking. Sometimes, and most of the times, it's better to look back in history rather than forward. And when you look back, you manage to move a lot more forward in history, and you get to eat food where it actually tastes of the region, it tastes of where it's from, and for me, it actually tastes of France and the region. Thank you.